All right, so you should all be able to see the slide deck on my screen. So this is the training that you're here for. Melinda, if you're ready, why don't we go ahead and dive into the content?
Let's do it.
So a good place for us to get started is for the two of us to introduce ourselves, so you have an idea of who we are and who the people you're learning from are today. Melinda, do you want to kick things off?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Melinda Freevert. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the digital principal at Fireside Campaigns. I have been in this business, and by this business, I mean doing digital and political spaces for 10 years now. I got my start back in my home state of Nebraska, which I am representing today, and have gone everywhere from Minnesota to Ohio to Emily's List, where I ran the email program for 4.5 years, to the DSCC, to Fireside, where I'm at now. And above everything, I love talking about testing because it's the #1 way to resolve contentious theoretical fights in your workplace.
And I'm Damian Shirley. I am the email director at Middle Seat. Like Melinda, I have been working in the digital space for a very long time now, about 12 years. And while I've done a little bit of everything here and there, I've mostly focused on email. Certainly over the past 7 or 8 years or so, that has been my sole focus. Like Melinda, I've also worked in a lot of different places. I've worked for a variety of political organizations and campaigns before making the transition over to being a consultant and working at an agency. And like Melinda, I also love email and love testing, and could talk about it endlessly, as the people on my team could probably attest to. But I'm excited that we have the chance to talk with you all today about how to run a testing program and how to use testing to improve your email performance, something that I've done a lot of and learned a lot about, and just excited to dive in with all of you. So we wanted to give you all a brief overview of just what we're going to be covering in today's training. So overall, we're just going to be answering a couple of questions really about how to run an email testing program. Everything from very basic, what is testing and how do I do it, to how do I pick the winner of a test and where do I go from there. Like I mentioned earlier, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A box and we'll try to address them. We're also planning on having some time left over for questions at the end. So if there's anything that we aren't able to get to as we're going through the content, we definitely want to circle back and just answer all the questions you have about how to run a testing program. So why don't we start with the basics? At its core, what is testing? What does it mean to run a test through email? Overall, when we're talking about how an email test is structured, it's when you launch multiple versions of your email that are identical to each other except for your test variable. So if you're trying to test 2 different senders to see which sender drives better performance, the 2 emails that you send, the only difference between them is going to be the sender. And that's because you want to isolate your variables. If there is a difference in performance between those 2 emails, you want to know that it's because of the different sender and not anything else. So if they're identical to each other, except for the thing you're testing, except for the sender, then you can have confidence that any difference between those multiple email versions is being driven by the thing that you're testing. And you want to launch those versions of your email to random representative samples of your overall email audience. And that's because you want to know that the results of your test are really applicable for your full email list. You know, if you're testing 2 different senders and you send one sender to your donors and the other sender to your non-donors, well, those audiences have some kind of bias, right? Your donors are likely to be a lot more active and are probably more likely to open and click on and engage in that email than your non-donors. So you don't really know if the difference there in performance is being driven by the sender that you're testing or the audience that you're sending it to. So by sending your test emails to random representative samples, you know there's likely not going to be any inherent bias. There's not going to be any other factor that affects performance except for the single thing that you're testing. And making sure that they're representative samples of your email list just really ensures that you can be confident that the results of your test are applicable across your email audience. That if you use, if you find that one sender performs better in your test, you can be confident that that sender is likely to continue performing better across your entire email universe. Once you've sent out your multiple test emails to your random representative audience, you then measure how those email versions perform. You see which one did better and how it did better. And then ultimately you want to use the results of that test to optimize your future emails. So if you find that one of your senders really does perform better, then you want to use that sender more in the future. So those are really kind of the broad strokes contours of what email testing looks like. Of course, there are a lot more details that are incredibly important, such as, why should I test and why is testing important even to begin with?
Thanks, Damien. This is Melinda again. So let's talk about why you should test. So the first thing, which I think is honestly the most important, is every email list is different. As I like to say, your email list is a special, unique unicorn, just as everybody else's email list is. What works for one of my clients who maybe is running for a House seat in Iowa is not necessarily going to be the same for a client who's running for a House seat in Washington State, right? Like those are different. Their list should be different. What works well for the DCCC is not going to work well for a small nonprofit working in Florida on voter turnout, right? So your list is different. Best practices are only guideposts. I also do pretty extensive training on how to write good emails. But I always have to open those trainings with the disclaimer of these are best practices accumulated from across the industry over a long time across a variety of spaces, and what works for your list may be different. Just because something works well for someone else doesn't mean it will work well for you. Just because a 500% match works well for the Trump campaign's texting list does not mean it's going to work well for your email list. You may also know how your supporters respond, but not why. And testing can really help you drill down into that and answer some of those finer details. The other thing that's worth noting is the landscape changes quickly. What worked well 6 months ago does not necessarily work well today. What worked well yesterday may not even work well today. One of my favorite stories is from the Obama campaign in 2012. I was one of the people who pitched a fit and was horrified that they started highlighting sentences in emails. I thought it was awful. I thought it was just generally bad. I didn't like how it looked, but they tested it and it worked really well with their list. But what they found about 3 to 6 months later is that the yellow highlighter no longer had an impact. So even your list changes over time and what they react to changes. And the other thing worth noting is that, new approaches keep your content fresh and engaging. A good email strategist is always innovating a little bit. Your email should not, like when you step back in big picture and if you like printed them all out and hung them up all on a wall, the ones you sent a year ago should not necessarily look like the ones you are sending today. Things change, your needs change. Sometimes your total brand changes. But the important thing for keeping folks engaged in your email program is keeping your content fresh and engaging. If they know what to expect, then they won't open your emails.
So Melinda, this is Damien. We have a question that I think would be good for us to jump on. So some folks hear that they shouldn't really worry about testing because their email list isn't big enough for the result to be statistically useful. How do we think about this particular issue? And are there tests that work well for smaller lists?
This is Melinda. I'm curious if Muslim advocates who asked that question, if you could share, if you're willing to share, I realize this is very personal, but roughly how big your list is. Is it between like 10 and 25,000? Is it 50 to 100? Okay. So I will say one thing on this. So I realize I just asked your list size. One thing to think about is how big is your active list? And we're going to dive into this a little bit later, but just because you have 60,000 email addresses does not mean that's your actual list size. If half of those people haven't opened an email from you in a year, then those people should not make up your list. We'll also dive into statistical significance a little bit at the end. But I would say there are some testing calculators out there that will help you figure out how big your list needs to be, how big your audience sample needs to be in order to test something. But the biggest way to address this with like small lists I would quantify under 75,000, is to run a test over a series of emails, right? Don't just test, if you're going to test, for example, button color, don't just do it on one email, do it on 3 or 4 emails or over an entire month. Make sure your audiences, your test groups are staying the same so that it's one group of people getting the blue button all month and one group of people getting a green button all month. But by doing a test that you can run over multiple emails, you can build up the sample size that you need to get statistically significant results. Damien, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so this is Damien. I agree on that. I generally like to say that the right size email list to test is whatever size your email list is. Like Melinda mentioned, if you can't get statistical confidence in test results based on the size of your list through one email send, you can continue testing something over the span of a couple of emails. It's not as statistically rigorous, but it will, over time, give you enough data for you to draw a solid conclusion. And like Melinda mentioned, that is something that we actually are going to touch on a little bit more in depth later. But it is a really important thing to consider, is how do you run a testing program at all scales and all sizes? So as we're getting into the basics of testing, a frequent question that we get is, okay, so I'm ready to run a test. What should I test? The short answer to that is everything. Anything you can really think of, any new approach, any new sender or format, or like Melinda mentioned, even button color can potentially have an impact. That being said, that's not really a helpful answer, is it? Test everything. So a good place to start, overall, you want to test approaches that are designed to improve your email performance, right? You want to think through what is a new approach we can test that's going to have some impact on how our emails perform. And a good place to start is to let your data guide you. So take a look at your email performance. See if there's a particular metric where maybe you're not performing well compared to benchmarks. Maybe you're not performing as well as you used to. Maybe your open rates are a little bit soft, in which case you should test something that will help boost your open rate. Something like your sender or your subject line is likely to have a really big impact on open rate, whereas button color probably wouldn't, because people have to open the email to even see that. So a good place to start is to let your data guide you, see where your performance is slacking off a little bit or where you're weak compared to benchmarks, and then come up with tests that will help boost that particular metric. Overall, we also recommend to make your tests scalable. So ultimately, if you're testing a new approach and it works well, you want to be able to use that approach in future emails. If you run a test that's only applicable to that one email, that's a useful test to run and it's good data to gather, but you can't really use that to optimize your program moving forward. So things like testing new senders, you can use that sender in your future emails. Even things like subject line structures. A particular subject line may only work for that one email, but you can test something like including first name personalization or other personalization that can give you results you can use moving forward. So if at all possible, think through tests that won't just work for one email or one type of emails, but new approaches that, if they win the test, can work well in a lot of your future emails. And also think outside the inbox. Pretty much every email you send is probably going to drive somebody to a donation form or a landing page. Well, that donation form, that landing page can have a huge impact on how your email ultimately performs. So if you're only testing stuff in the email itself, then you might potentially be leaving money or actions on the table. So make sure to think through not just the stuff that lands in somebody's inbox, but really all aspects of your email and the entire user journey, from getting that email to taking whatever action you were asking them to take and then what they experience afterward. Anything along that journey is an opportunity for you to test and could have a strong impact on your ultimate performance. So we do have a question that I think would be good for us to address, which is, how can you benchmark a newly created list? And Melinda, why don't I kick that one over to you?
Melinda here. So April, I think the question of, benchmarking a new list is you benchmark it by starting. One thing I think most folks don't do is track their email performance data. And depending on the tool set you're using, that's actually pretty easy, right? Like Every Action /NGP8, Blue State Digital, Action Network, all of them, if you go into your sent email dashboard, you can pretty quickly see open rates, click rates. You can't always see action rates depending on, what you're using as your action pages or donate pages. But this is why, especially as a consultant for all my clients, we have built out email performance dashboards. It's just a Google Doc where we literally drop all the information we want on our emails. Number of people we sent to, number of opens, open rate, clicks, click rate, actions taken, donations made, amount raised. And by tracking all of that for each email, we're able to go and look and see what's normal and what's not. Are there trends we're seeing? Are open rates trending down, right? Like that's always a big question. But yeah, so to benchmark, like just start tracking. A dashboard doesn't have to be something you update every day. It can be something you update once a week. That's about how often we do it. But I highly recommend creating a dashboard or having some sort of system where you're constantly going to check your numbers at least on a weekly basis and noticing trends.
Yeah, this is Damien. That's a great thing to do. If you're not doing it, highly recommend it. Track your own email performance. Get a sense of what your typical performance metrics are. That will help both see if there starts to be any aberrant behavior, if your open rates start declining, or if your click-through rates start going up for some reason. There are also benchmarking reports you can take a look at. I know the folks over at M&R put together an annual benchmarking report. I know Blackbaud does an annual benchmarking report. Those are, they won't be as specific to your particular list or program, but if you don't have a lot of data, they're an all right place to start. You can kind of see, based on what type of email program we're running, whether it's political, whether it's a nonprofit, whether it's based around fundraising or actions, then you can kind of get a sense of, okay, what are other people in our space? What are they seeing? What do they look like? And then from there, you can kind of compare your own performance. It's good to work from your own metrics when you can. But if you don't yet have a lot of data, then finding an existing benchmarking report is a good way for you to kind of just see broadly, how are you performing compared to other folks in your space. So dovetailing with that last slide, Melinda and I put our heads together and we kind of just came up with some really quick, a few different places to start, a few different really common tests out there. Obviously, this is by no means a comprehensive list. The list of things you can test would probably fill up many, many, many slides. But if you're still kind of at a loss of what new things to test or where to start, these are not bad places to begin. Everything from your subject line, which will have the biggest impact on who opens your email, all the way through your landing page layout, which will have the biggest impact on who converts and what your conversion rates are. So by no means a comprehensive list, but if you're still looking for testing ideas or still wondering where a good place to start is, here are some good places to start. So those are kind of the basics of testing. The kind of what is it and why should I do it and where do I begin? Once you've made the decision to start testing and to run a testing program, where do you go next? So I think Melinda can start walking us through the process of the different types of tests you can begin running.
So there are three main types of tests we'll cover, Melinda here. So there will be an A/B split test, multivariate tests, and pre-launch tests. These are the three main ones we use in this field. If you're a data scientist, there are many types of tests you can run, but as practitioners, we're keeping it simple. So first up is A/B split test. So this one is probably the most straightforward and the one most of you have heard of, ideally, right? So what does it mean? In an A/B split, you are testing a single variable. That's really important. as Damien laid out in the beginning, right, like we're talking about a subject line, a sender, a button color, that list of things we laid out that you can test, you're picking one of those. You send it to a random representative sample. Again, this is the most common type of test. It's easy to set up and it's scalable. But the most important thing here is you're testing one thing and just splitting your list. You can do, it can even be an ABC test, but you're splitting your list into even segments of a random representative sample and testing one thing. I will throw it over to David on multivariate.
Sorry about that. I had that. This is Damien. I had that fun experience of not being able to get to my mute button in time, and then Zoom angrily giving that pop-up saying, "Are you trying to talk? You're still muted." So didn't think I would get through this training without doing that at least once, so apologies. In addition to the A/B split test, there's also what is known as multivariate testing. Multivariate testing is when you're testing multiple test variables. So say you want to test a new sender, but also a new button color. You could test them at the same time by setting up a multivariate test. The challenge with multivariate testing, there are a couple. The first is that with each new test variable you add, the setup process gets exponentially more complicated. You have to set up significantly more test variants, and you also have to create significantly more segments of your list to test too. So for instance, going back to the example I mentioned, if you want to test a new sender and a new button color, to really have a statistically rigorous multivariate test, you need to set up 4 different versions of your email. One with the old sender and the old button, one with the new sender and the old button, one with the old sender and the new button, and one with the new sender and the new button. That's a lot of work. And some folks may ask, like, well, why don't I just test old sender, old button versus new sender, new button? You could do that, but then you don't actually know which of those variants is driving the difference in performance. You could find that new sender or new button has a pretty big boost, but you don't know if that's being driven by the sender or by the button or by a combination. If you were to run a rigorous multivariate test, you might actually find that the sender is driving a huge increase in performance, but the button is actually suppressing performance. So if you just move ahead with new sender, new button, you're actually leaving money or clicks or actions on the table. So to really run a rigorous test, that means you have to set up basically twice as many test variants, and it means you also have to divide your ultimate audience even smaller, right? If you have a 10,000 person active email list, if you're just running one test, you can split that up, 5,000 people in one test segment, 5,000 people in the other. If you're running a multivariate test, testing 2 different variables, well, then you're talking about splitting each of those in half. You only have 2,500 active people per test variant, which means it's harder for you to get statistical significance. So what I'd say about multivariate testing, you can do it, certainly if you have a larger or more active list, but there often really isn't much of a reason to. Unless you're super pressed for time and need to test as many things as quickly as you can, you could just test your new sender, get the results there, and then test your new button.
And Damien, we have a question about what happens in A/B tests, though I think we can talk about this in terms of any test when the results are not significant enough for the list size. Any advice on that and how to best interpret non-significant results?
Yeah, actually, Damien here. We're going to touch base on what happens if you get a non-significant results in a couple of slides. So I'm glad that you asked that. Let us circle back to that.
Yep, Brittany, we will answer that in a couple of places. But definitely ask again if you're not getting an answer that's helpful. Great. So then the final type of test we'll talk about is a pre-launch test. And as the name implies, you are doing this in advance of something. So the idea with a pre-launch test is you're sending to a portion of your list. You are pulling out, again, a random representative sample, testing your variables on them, determining the winner, and then sending the winning variant to the remainder of your list. The most common way we do this is subject line tests. any organization I work with that has an active list size over 75,000, we have a conversation about subject line testing. Because it is, as a fundraiser, it is the #1 way to bring in more email or more money, except for possibly senders, which is another thing I don't think we test enough in this industry. But yeah, so what we'll do is we will, pull out 15 or 20 or 25,000 people from the active list. We will send them all the same email, with the only variant being a few different subject lines that we want to try. We'll wait for an hour. We go look and see which one has the most donations, and then we send that one to the remaining 50,000 people on the list. And it's a way to very quickly bring in more money, more actions, whatever it is you're trying to do. Pre-launch tests are the number one thing I would say, if your list is big enough, you should be doing on a regular basis. The one thing about it that is a disadvantage is it's not always great for rapid response, right? Kamala Harris just gets announced as VP, and you want to get an email out right now. You don't want to wait an hour for results. You might just pick a subject line you feel best about and send it out straight to your list. But if you're willing to take the time and wait, they can be really helpful. Sometimes also, if I'm trying to run a pre-launch test in the middle of like major breaking news, I might, instead of waiting an hour for results, I'll wait a half an hour and double my audience size so I get stronger results earlier on. So what now? I'm going to hand it over to Damien to answer that question.
Yeah, this is Damien, and I think this is the point at which we'll dive a little bit into what you do if your results are a little bit inconclusive. So you made the decision to test, you figured out what new thing you want to try. We have a good question coming in, which I think would be good for us to actually dive into before we get into the picking a winner portion. Basically, the question is, how many people do you need to do a pre-launch test to get an effective or good enough answer? So I can kind of start with that. So generally, I structure pre-launch tests as an overall percentage of my list. Usually, it depends a little bit on the size of list, but usually I aim for my tests to go out to about at least 10% of the overall list. Certainly more data is better in this case. The bigger your sample size, the more confident you can be in your results. But I usually structure it as a percentage of the list. If the list is a little less active, or if I know that I won't get very strong results quickly, I can do what Melinda talked about in terms of increasing the audience size, but within reason, right? If you're testing your subject lines to 50% of your active list, well, you'll probably get good results, but then you're also missing out on being able to optimize, send the winning subject line to a bigger portion of your list. So generally, 10% is a good place to start. I have even gone up to 20 or 25% of the list. But I would say this is also a place, certainly with pre-launch testing, because by nature they kind of have to move quickly, where this might be a little bit more of an art than a science, where you might launch your pre-launch tests, 3 different subject lines to 10% of your list, and then an hour or so later, take a look at the open rates, take a look at how the emails are performing, and then make a call from that. But I'd also be interested to hear what Melinda's thoughts are in terms of what a good size is for pre-launch testing.
Yes, Cindy, this is Melinda. Also agree, this is a really good question. So this is also definitely why I say pre-launch tests are great once your list is a certain size, and you should absolutely be doing it. They're hard to do with list sizes under 75, under 50,000 actives. That's why if I had a client who had a list that was smaller, I have a lot of clients whose lists are under that size. I tend to recommend A/B testing a lot more because it's an easier way to get clearer results that you can take action on later. So that's the first thing I'd say. The other thing, and we'll talk about statistical significance later. Again, I'm glad we included that slide, Damien, because we were like, we should cut that. And they were like, let's throw it in case we need more time. The other thing I would say is So the other thing to know if a pre-launch test is worth doing is figuring out what sample size you should use. And I'm actually in the chat box going to drop Optimizely's sample size calculator. So feel free to like copy this. It's not the most user friendly, by which I mean like baseline conversion rate, minimum detectable effect, statistical significance. Like those are all a little bit wonky in terms. But what this tool can do is, right, like if you're talking about a pre-launch test and talking about significant, looking for effect, if you're looking at like donation rates, it might be a lot harder to find a detectable effect. Whereas like if you're asking people to sign a petition, it may be much easier to detect an effect because it's an action more people are taking, right? So something that's easier for people to do, you might not need as large of a sample size, or something that's harder for people to do, donating, making a phone call to their representative, things like that, your results are going to be really low because it's a harder ask. It's higher up on the ladder of engagement. And so you might need a really big sample size to pull that off. So the Optimizely's sample size calculator can really help with that. Yeah, things like open rates, easier to detect a high change in. Things like making a donation or calling your congressperson, harder.
Yeah, this is Damien again. I'll also say, once you've done your pre-launch tests, make sure to go back and take a look at how your tests performed like a day or so later, right? So you have 3 different subject lines. You send an email with each of those subject lines to a small test panel. You know, an hour or so later, you see, okay, subject line 3 seems to be doing the best. Let me send subject line 3 out to the whole list. Well, I would say the next day, go back and look at how those 3 test sends ultimately performed. You might find that, you know, an hour in, subject line 3 was winning, but 24 hours later, maybe subject line 2 actually pulled ahead. That's really useful data. That could tell you that maybe your list is not responding as quickly as they need to for good pre-launch testing, in which case, like Melinda said, maybe in the future you want to increase the number of people that each of those subject line tests go to so you can get more results more quickly. So that's something I always like to do, is the next day take a look back and see, okay, did the result that I called, did it actually hold true, or do I need to kind of change the way I approach this a little bit? So then diving into the picking a winner portion of things. So you run a test, you sent out your test variants. How do you know what won? Obviously, the best place to start is to take a look at your data. See how your emails perform, see how each test variant performs. In terms of KPIs, which are key performance indicators, keep those in mind. For instance, if you were running a test to try to boost your open rate, then I would say that's the KPI, that's the key performance indicator you want to look at the most when you're gauging your test results. Did our new approach boost the open rate? Was there a difference in terms of the open rate? If you're running a test on the landing page to try to boost conversion rates, then I would say focus more on the conversion rate. You know, opens and clicks, actually, if you're testing on the landing page, that test isn't going to affect your opens and clicks at all. So really, when trying to figure out who the winner was, take a look at your performance data and really try to dial down into what metrics you're trying to move or what metrics are most important to you. Like Melinda mentioned earlier, more data is better. If you run a test and you get kind of a mixed bag, keep that test going. Run it over the course of a couple of emails, or run it with a bigger audience size if you're able to. I look at it a little bit like if you're trying to run a poll in a swing state, right? If you poll one voter, that's not a lot of data. That's probably not a really good poll, and it probably doesn't tell you a lot about how where things stand with that race. But if we're able to poll every single voter in the state, well, then you probably have a really good sense of where that race stands. Testing is similar. The more data you have, the more confident you can be in your results. So if your results are inconclusive, if you run a test and it's kind of a mixed bag and none of your KPIs are really different and no results kind of stand out, you can continue the test. Just kind of keep running that test over the span of the next couple of email sends to see, as you gather more data, does a difference emerge? Does one particular variant start pulling away in terms of the metrics that matter most to you? If you're not able to continue the test for whatever reason, you can always retest. So at some point in the future, you can come back and say, all right, we're going to run this test again. And that time you may get enough data for you to draw a solid conclusion. So if you can't continue the test, you can always kind of put the test on the back burner and come back to it at some point in the future. Like I mentioned earlier, prioritize those KPIs. So if you run a test and you find that, you know, one variant has a lower open rate but a higher click-through rate, well, which one matters more to you? If you were trying to boost click-through rate, then that may be a trade-off you're willing to take. So if you have mixed results, if you find that, you know, there's a difference in terms of how these different email variants are affecting your metrics, then something you can do is just decide which one you prioritize, which matters more to you. There are some folks who are always going to prioritize conversion rate over everything else because that's just what they want their program to be driving toward. But ultimately, really the main rule of testing is first do no harm. So if you test a new approach and you get kind of mixed results, but you want to keep using that new approach, maybe it makes email setup a little bit easier, maybe you just like it more, go ahead and keep using it. You know, if you test a new approach and it's not harming your performance, then that's not a bad thing. You know, I've certainly tested approaches in the past that I've just liked easier, or email formats that have looked nicer, or honestly, even just ways of setting up emails that saves me a little bit of time and effort, and the tests have been inconclusive. But in that case, then just go with what you like better. The data is telling you this new approach isn't bad. It's not driving down your performance. So if you want to go with it, go with it. And I also see that we have another question. So why don't we dive in and address that one? So somebody is talking about working for a small and fairly new organization that doesn't even have more than a few thousand folks on their list. The question is, should that person still be doing testing? You know, I would say that we will talk a little bit later about statistical significance, and we do link to a really handy tool that you can use to try to get to statistical significance. Testing with small lists is always tricky. It's a little bit hard to run a test and know, falling short of being able to calculate statistical significance, you know, is this test really moving the needle? Is it not? Is this list too small? But I would say, you know, ultimately give it a shot. Test with your list, the list that you have. See if you can kind of see if you get results that are far enough apart that even if maybe they're not statistically significant, they give you some kind of directional learning. And if you find that you're running tests with your list and it's all kind of a mixed bag, then maybe, you know, it is a good time to focus on growing that list and growing that active audience and revisiting testing down the road. I don't know, Melinda, if you have thoughts on either the picking a winner or the testing size question.
Yeah, Melinda here. I think I would especially, Heather, take a look at how much time are you spending on setting up these tests for the results that you're getting, because this is also, I think, a little bit a question of efficiency. And as Damien noted, you know, I think running a couple of A/B tests could help, right? If it's helping you get in more actions, get stronger results for your program, that's great. But if it's taking you, you know, 2 hours to set up these tests, and that's time you could be spending building the lists or writing more content, then that's something to factor in. Cool. All right, and then I will move on to where to go from there, right? So how do you pick a winner? What happens next? So first thing is apply your results to future sends, right? We've been carping on this the entire training. You want to pick things that you can do over and over again, not just things that are going to affect a single email one time. The pre-launch tests are a little bit of an exception to that. Plan your next test. You did one, now do another one, and then do another one after that. Another thing to note is add it to your testing library. So this is also a thing that tends to get left behind, right? It's like it's the end of a campaign. Nobody really worries about filing all the field data on November 4th or even November 3rd. Don't do that to yourself, because a year later you will be thinking to yourself, what were the results when we tested those button colors? I can't remember. Write it down. It doesn't have to be long, 50 words, a few screenshots of like what you tested and notes on like what the results were and what you decided to do next. Put it in a Google Doc or a Google spreadsheet somewhere where you can access it in the future and refer to it and remember what your results were. don't force yourself to try to remember all of this in your brain. And then don't forget to retest, right? We've talked about this a couple times, but trends in email change pretty quickly. So just because something worked 6 months ago on your list doesn't mean it'll work now. So if there was something that had a really big result on your list within the 6 months to a year ago, I would recommend going back and testing it again and seeing if those results still hold true. And then remember, there's no such thing as a failed test. So as Damien noted with do no harm, what's really important here is you learned something. You learned that it doesn't matter what color your button is, your list will take action regardless. It does not matter how big the font in your email is. It can be 8 points or it can be 20 points and people still have no problem engaging with your content. So you learned something, even if you didn't get a clear answer. Knowledge is power. Never feel like just because you didn't get a clear result that you wasted your time. You still have takeaways and can use that to make decisions going forward. Which then we get to talk about statistical significance, which is great because this has come up a few times. So Damien, do you want to tackle this one a little bit?
Yeah, so Damien here. I know that we are running a little bit short on time, so why don't we make this kind of the last slide we focus on, and then we can dive into questions, or we can walk through different testing examples if folks are interested in that. So statistical significance is a difficult thing to talk about because neither of us are really statisticians, and it's also a hard thing to talk about without putting everyone to sleep. Overall, statistical significance, it's basically determining if the results of your test actually are significant or if it's just kind of noise. If there's actually something there that was driving a performance difference, or if it just happened to be random chance that this one test variant did better than the other. I mean, certainly if you are a data expert or if you have access to data experts, you can run those calculations to see if your email tests have statistical significance. But not everybody has those resources or that knowledge. I certainly do not have that knowledge. Fortunately, there are tools out there that will help you calculate statistical significance. M&R has a chi-square test. It's something that you can Google and find pretty easily. I think we can also drop a link to it in the chat box so people can access it a little bit more easily as well. But that's a place where literally you can just plug in the data from the test that you ran, and it'll run some calculations and say whether or not your results are significant or if it's not. It is a free tool. You can probably Google it right now and find it. That is what I did. Melinda also just dropped a link in there, which is super handy. Thank you, Melinda. If you ask a statistician, they will say, you do all the calculations and it says your results are, significant with a particular confidence interval. Like a statistician will say that you want a 95% or higher confidence interval. That basically says like 95% or more of the time, like the results of your test will continue to hold true. We're not statisticians. We're not writing a scientific paper. Generally, if you run the calculations, anything that's 80% or higher is probably pretty solid. Again, the email world changes really quickly. Things evolve, things move. So if you want to go through the work of running these calculations and getting these results, go ahead. It is good to be statistically rigorous, but just keep in mind that, we're not necessarily scientists. I think we can apply a little bit of a different standard here.
Melinda here. I just want to underline all of that. I've had data managers before who have complained that a test did not meet the 95% confidence threshold. And I was like, I don't care. I'm not publishing this in a research paper. This was we are 85% confident that what we tested had an impact on the results. So I'm going to go with that. It's fine. Great. So should we turn it over for questions? We've got 5 minutes left in this panel.
Yeah, Damien here. I think if there are folks who have questions that they've been holding on to or things they want us to dive into a little bit more, something I am going to do for the benefit of folks is I'm going to go back to that slide with all the testing ideas on it. So in case anybody wants to write these down or do a screenshot or do whatever works best, if you're looking for testing ideas. but I think in these last 5 minutes, if there are folks who have questions, we would love to dive into them a little bit more. We also have a couple of examples of some tests that we've run and the results that we saw, but I think, we want this to be your time.
Yeah. So Melinda here, feel free to type your questions in the chat box or in the Q&A. We will be watching both. Okay. So Caitlin talked about more testing examples. Ben wants to know about sender choices. So actually, Damien, do you want to go to the Beto example? Or I think, yeah.
Yes,
that client.
Yeah. Damien here. So this is a test that we have run. Somebody asked about sender choices. So if you're working for an organization, you don't just have to send from the organization name. If you're sending from a campaign, you don't always have to send from the candidate name. It's pretty common to have, like, if you're a campaign, Team Cori Bush or Team Beto O'Rourke senders. Something that we've tested and seen success with multiple different email programs is testing a .com or a .org email sender. So these are some tests that we've run. These are just a few examples of the ones we ran it with, but we worked with Beto O'Rourke's Senate campaign in 2018. We worked with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and we tested sort of the typical team senders, Team Beto versus BetoO'Rourke.com. We've tested like Team AOC versus OcasioCortez.com. If you're on AOC's email list, you've probably gotten a couple of emails from OcasioCortez.com. And we found that the .com and the .org senders actually boost open rates by a pretty solid percentage. It's not a huge boost, but it is consistent, both across emails and across clients. So when you're thinking through senders, think outside the box. You don't just have to send from an organization name or even from a person's name. You can experiment with all sorts of things. I'll even test from, like if we're working with a candidate, candidate name headquarters or candidate name HQ. Really, any new sender you can think of, give it a shot.
And Melinda here, we have a question in the Q&A. Have we done any tests on growing lists? I assume you mean lists that are currently growing. We've had some success asking people to forward to a friend. Oh, no, you do mean on list growth strategies. I have not done any tests on specific list growth strategies within an inbox. Where those tend to be tested are when we're doing like ad acquisitions. We'll test content in that ad acquisition. We will also track the return on investment for our acquisition sources. So also in the same Google spreadsheet where I keep track of my performance data, I also add a tab for ROI on acquisition, and I know, the date we acquired a group batch of names, where they came from, and then, each week or once a month, I'll go through and know, how many actions have they taken, how much money have they raised. So that's sort of, it's not testing, but it is performance tracking. Damien, would you add anything there?
Yeah, Damien here. So it's tricky, just because even tactics like forward this email to a friend, it's hard to track performance. It's hard to see actually who did the forwarding and then how many friends signed up. I would say in terms of growing your list through different organic means, though, I mean, certainly asking folks on your list to forward things along is helpful. Asking folks to share your actions or content on social media can also be effective. I would also say make sure that you're asking, if you have a social media presence, make sure you're occasionally asking folks on there to join your email list. Put a post on Facebook, tweet every once in a while, cross-pollinate those digital channels as much as you can. I would say, also take a look at you can also do email swaps with different like-minded organizations, for instance. So you send an action, you write an action email that your partner organization sends to their list. They do the same. You kind of get folks on each other's list to sign up a little bit. And there are also paid ways that you can grow your list. Sponsored social media posts, digital advertising. It's a little bit harder to run rigorous tests around those. So I think what Melinda was talking about is the right approach. Take a look at your performance, take a look at the new people you're acquiring, use source coding as much as you can to try to track who came from where, and then kind of see what returns you're getting from different list growth approaches. So the host is telling us that we are at time. That is the end of the training. But thank you all for coming out and taking time out of your day to learn a little bit about email testing.
And this is Melinda. I know we get this room for a few extra spare minutes. Isabella, I saw your question in the chat about an org that doesn't have an email program. You just send stuff through email addresses. I would strongly recommend signing up for Action Network. It's free up to a certain level, and you will be able to track stats like who's opening your email, which you just can't do when you're sending stuff from your personal inboxes. That's my pitch. I swear they did not pay me to say that. It's just usually my first go-to recommendation.
All right, well, if folks want to make their way out to the virtual hallway, once again, thank you all for turning out. We really love talking with you all about email. Thank you for your amazing questions. And I'm looking forward to spending the rest of Netroots with you all.
Come find us on social media. We're not clever. Our handles are our names. Awesome. All right, I'm gonna head out and go back to work. This was fun.